What is our Dharma? What is our quest? What do we mean by embodied practice? So there's all kinds of skills that are associated with being a seeker, whether or not we want to recognize them as skills. We talked in my last podcast about focus being one of the preeminent skills that you actually have to cultivate, and really how that becomes not just a skill, but almost kind of a precious commodity in a sense, when everything about modern life is so crowded and demanding of someone's time. So all of a sudden, if we are on a mission, which we can in one definition or another say is a spiritual one, it means that there's actually skills that are required to be able to go on that mission and do it well. So when we talk about embodied practices, we could be talking about yoga. And yoga, when we think of skills, the immediate connotation there is, for a lot of people, I think, how much can I increase my stretchiness? Or like, how good can my plank be? And my handstands and all these other things that require both flexibility and strength attributes. All of a sudden, those are very literal skills that go into the idea of something like an embodied practice like yoga. But by no means is that the only skill in that particular embodied practice. We would be ridiculous if we left it off at that, right? So, yoga is just one very convenient one that I like to pick on because, number one, I am a certified yoga teacher and I do teach yoga from time to time. I do regularly, actually, on my schedule, I have yoga classes that I have to teach. It's not my everyday job though, right? And if it was, I think it would probably be something that I liked a lot less than I do. But we don't even have to just be talking about yoga. And in my particular case, that's definitely not the only one in terms of embodied practices that's of interest. So for me, martial arts is another huge one. And I say arts plural because I don't just do one. For me, there's lots of different utilities in a pragmatic sense that come with martial arts. But there's also a lot of really incredible aspects to it at a spiritual, intellectual, emotional level. And there's different ones that provide different assets for someone's life. So, for example, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Judo, there is very much a built-in adversarial component to it. It can be playful in its adversarial aspects, but what do I mean by adversarial? It means it's possible to do something poorly and quote-unquote lose because of it. Right? So if I'm having a friendly grappling match in jiu-jitsu, and if my skills on the mat aren't really developed yet, I can get kind of manhandled by someone whose skills are. If my skills are not really super developed in yoga, I'm not going to go to class and have like some definitive contest with rules where someone else, without any possible doubt, quote unquote, wins that engagement. Right? If the person next to me is doing all these amazing floaty handstands, there might be a general sentiment in the room that, at least in terms of the purely physical aspects of practice, like the flexibility, the stability, the balance, upper body strength, core strength, whatever, someone might say, wow, that person is really good at yoga. And they may even kind of internally phrase it in a way that's like, oh, that person is much better than the other person at yoga. But there's nothing structurally that really makes it that way, per se. You could argue that there's lots of levels to yoga instruction and like being a disciple of a yoga guru, and that in that sense there's some kind of implicit rank, but it's not like there's no situation there per se like there is in something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Judo, where if I have a lot of built-in gifts, or if I get lucky, or if I catch someone who has a quote-unquote higher rank above me, if I catch them making mistakes, like I can actually beat them in a grapple, even if I'm not necessarily skilled. There's not really a component like that in yoga. There's there's more sort of like self-determined, like if you compete with yourself, you could definitely frame it in that sense. Like yesterday, I could not do a handstand. Today, I can do a handstand. And maybe there's like a big incremental progress journey that preceded that. But the practice and embodying that practice on a day-to-day basis has very different goals. And there's a lot about yoga, just to continue this compare and contrast, where there's not necessarily something that's quote unquote falsifiable. And what do I mean by that? In martial arts, I can teach someone a technique, and let's just say I was feeling mischievous that day and it's just something I made up. Like, it's not a technique that I actually learned anywhere. It's something I've made up and I never actually tested it on someone, but it like maybe kind of sort of looks feasible. And I just, for giggles, I teach that to a class without ever having actually tested it. People could go out and try that technique, and 10 times out of 10, it won't work. And they'll end up getting like beaten or dominated in a friendly or less than friendly match when they try to use that technique. It's not necessarily like that in yoga per se. There's a lot less things that can be quote unquote falsifiable in adversarial testing. So what's one of the consequences of this? If I'm a yoga instructor and I teach someone a way to get up into a handstand that's just absolute gobbledygook and nonsense, there's actually a chance that the student on the other end hearing it can can hear that and think that they're hearing something a little bit different and do something with their own body even while listening to that terrible advice. And I don't want to call it a placebo effect, but like through their own inbuilt bodily intuitions and, a handful of other factors, they could still succeed in that handstand attempt despite whatever gobbledygook was coming out of their teacher's mouth. It's a lot harder to do something like that in martial arts and grappling, like a lot harder. If you teach someone gobbledygook, and the person tries it, they can actually get immediate negative feedback, or they could get killed if you're teaching them like self-defense. So there are immediate repercussions as far as whether or not you're getting quality information. If we were to take the yoga example, we could go to a yoga school where there were a bunch of shoddy instructors. I don't know, maybe they got their, since yoga is an unregulated industry, maybe they just went online, watched a few videos, and then got a certification that says, I am a 200-hour yoga teacher. And maybe this hypothetical yoga studio has nothing but teachers like that. And all the students that attend that studio just have very noticeably bad, uncorrected, bad yoga posture practice, almost to the point of it being a safety risk. But if no one's there to correct them, there's not necessarily an immediate feedback element per se. There are feedback elements like, oh, if I did this handstand wrong based on gobbledygook, maybe I fell and maybe I hurt myself. But again, in my own experience, I've had people explain very badly how I should do certain yoga poses, and I could tell that what they were saying, just from my experience with embodied practices elsewhere, I could tell that whatever they were saying was just pure nonsense. And I still just kind of reasoned out my own way to execute whatever the posture was and kind of figured it out on my own. But that's because the handstand posture itself is not gobbledygook. It is a known posture. The person instructing it might be full of crap, but if it's actually a technique, and it's been tested elsewhere by others, there is sort of an aspect of intuition on the part of the practice where the person doing it can kind of figure it out on their own a little bit. That's been my own personal experience. Even though I've had tremendous yoga instruction, particularly at my home studio, Thrive Yoga and Fitness, right? Absolutely tremendous, very gifted instructors. But I've also gone to other classes elsewhere where I've just gotten pure nonsense, just because I was like, oh, this gym that I already go to has a yoga class. Maybe I'll drop in. And I didn't know the instructor. And once they started, they were just like, they were just really bad. And thankfully, some of the almost nonsensical kind of stuff that they were trying to show, I was able to reason myself through it or say, wow, I don't know how to do that. and this person's explaining it badly, and me trying to guess it would be a safety risk. So I'm just going to modify and do something else other than that. So now let's flip back to martial arts. There are a bunch of traditional martial arts in terms of an embodied practice where there are not testable consequences for just doing whatever, right? And what does something like that look like? If there's like a traditional martial art where they're like, my teacher's teacher in an unbroken lineage taught me all these forms and they're arranged in this way and you have to learn them in just this way. That is a way for people to pass down quote unquote knowledge in a relatively unbroken line for like generation after generation after generation. But the question is, what is being passed down? So with something like martial arts, there is actually sort of a testing field for, if not every aspect of it, then a lot of aspects of it. So there are testing grounds that civilians can do. Like, for example, they can have an MMA fight, or they can look at the sum total of what a bunch of other MMA fighters have already done. And if there's something that just seems like total fantasy material from a traditional martial art where it's been passed down unbroken for who knows how many generations, but it's never been tested in an environment where it can actually go wrong or it can actually go right, it's almost anyone's guess as to whether or not it actually works. You're just taking someone's word for it. But if someone goes into the octagon in an MMA fight and they perform nonsense techniques that they learned from a grand wise old sensei or guru, but it was never tested, they can get hurt real bad. And this is actually something that we saw in the early UFCs, where a bunch of people from certain martial arts, like some of them were kickboxers, which is like that's a real live environment where stuff is tested. Some of them are boxers. That's also a real live environment where stuff is tested. All of those according to their own rule sets, right? But a handful of guys who went in there were coming from traditional martial arts of one degree or another without any actual live sparring, testing, whatever element to it. And they went in there and they got mauled, right? So sometimes I try to think about this in terms of embodied practices, what I've learned from my experience in one area and how it applies to the other. And this is pretty squarely in the bullseye of what I have in mind when I say spiritual warrior, in like as far as its many different dimensions and its many aspects. And this is one of them. There is a certain sort of pragmatism that someone who does embodied practices will bring to the table if those embodied practices included martial arts where stuff can go wrong and you'll suffer if it goes wrong. And it's like you'll find out real quick if what you're doing is fantasy stuff. That is admittedly very much a lens through which I've experienced a lot of my own yoga experience. And yoga very much is one of those lineage-based practices where you'll have a succession of teachers and there's a high priority and like there's a high stock value, so to speak, based on something from a quote unquote pure lineage. And this is also reflected in spiritual teachers of, let's say, like Buddhism or Hinduism varieties and all these sorts of things. But the problem is this is not information that can be adversarially tested per se. There's no one there trying to break it to see what parts of it are broken. Kind of like if you're in the market as a technologist and you're releasing software or you're releasing devices, you usually have a room full of people trying to break it on purpose to see what doesn't work about it before you send it out there to the public. And a lot of these pure lineage embodied practices, like let's say a traditional martial art, or I hate to say it, but a lot of yoga traditions where there's as much as we want to say yoga is a science, there's parts of it that really are not in any way scientific at all. Like there's an argument like, oh, a lot of these techniques have been cultivated century after century after century. And when it's spoken that way, it's spoken as if it couldn't possibly be wrong, or there couldn't possibly be any other efficient way to do whatever the goal is of the activity that you're doing, or even like these things are said with a crazy degree of confidence as far as exactly what kind of effect it has on the person doing it, and an even higher degree of confidence that whatever that effect is has nothing to do with the placebo effect. Now, I've gone to all this trouble of saying that this is a lens through which I see these things, and I would predict that someone hearing me say this would be like, oh, wow, well, this person doesn't believe in any of the magical stuff about yoga or like any of the actual kind of irreducible spiritual benefits. And the thing is, that's not really accurate. I've personally experienced a lot of really wonderful things about yogic practice, and not just the stretchy workout aspects, but, all the goals of the 8 limbs of yoga in terms of trying to go further and further inside yourself in a way that excludes distractions to achieve some sort of bliss experience, and maybe even unify yourself with some sense of consciousness that in a way seems to transcend yourself as an individual. Those are all goals that I think are wonderful. And I think for me, it's just one of the biggest things that I can communicate just from having done embodied practices that have both of these sorts of aspects to them. And I've seen the vulnerabilities that come along with embodied practices that have quote unquote pure lineages where things are never tested by someone actively trying to break it. It's just the phrase that comes to mind for me all the time. That's another one of the filters for my experience here, is the map is not the territory. So if I get really hung up on exactly what this guru said about this particular pose down to the atomic detail, or exactly what this guru said about all the diet stuff, just as one example, there's a lot of that where I have a wealth of my own experience dealing with other embodied practices, both with and without adversarial testing, where I just have I know what I know as far as the vulnerability of knowledge being passed down from person to person, and how there's a little bit of a paradox in that vulnerability, because let me actually speak to the other end of that for a moment. When people look at how knowledge is transmitted in writing versus oral traditions, generally one of the paradoxically wrong assumptions is that the stuff that's transmitted via writing is a lot purer or contains less errors. But interestingly enough, the opposite is true. Oral culture, when things are transmitted orally, like for example the Vedas, or like ancient Greek epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, these sorts of things, when they look at things that are transmitted orally versus written, there's such a higher degree of fidelity and accuracy in oral transmission than there is in writing. It's not even close. When people transmit knowledge in writing, for example, when a lot of people were copying down sacred scripture in the Western traditions and these sorts of things, a lot of the scholarly activity looking at that stuff spends a lot of its time trying to look at the common core of a bunch of variant translations where people would just insert little things here and there according to their own tastes, or their translation was just like wildly weird and different. Or in certain cases where people would have simple errors, which then would get reproduced over and over again in writing. But some of those transmission glitches weren't simple, and they weren't just errors. Some of them were like wild interpolations where people would just insert crazy stuff. But then that, from that point on, it would get included in this guy's copy and that guy's copy and this guy's copy. So on the one hand, we're tempted to say, oh, well, all these traditions like yoga and traditional martial arts that have been passed down in that guru or honored sensei pure lineage kind of model, we're tempted to say, oh, well, surely all that stuff must be accurate because we've learned what we've learned about oral cultures having more of a fidelity in terms of their ability to pass down information. But here's the thing. It's a question of what they're passing down. So one concrete example of this is, let's take one of these traditional martial arts where the way that they were teaching certain things, like let's say if it's a traditional martial art where they taught punches that were nowhere near as functional as Western boxing punches, just like not even a contest, not even close. But the reason why they might have been passed down a certain way could have been a handful of different explanations, one of which could have been they just had a bad model of understanding and they didn't know that there was a better technique out there. That, and I admit that that's one of them. But another one is a lot of the martial arts that taught punches the way they did taught cross functionality, and by saying like, if there's a weapon in this guy's hand, he's going to do it this way, and if there's not a weapon, he's going to do it the same way, because we only have so much bandwidth to train people in these body dynamics, right? So and most of what we're concerned with is training these people to have a weapon in their hand. And like, a lot of military training conforms to that. There's only a certain amount of effort put into hand-to-hand combat because the assumption is that you're, generally speaking, you should have your weapon, right? So under those sorts of pressures where they only had so much training time over such a wide manpower to get that like wide pool of bodies where they would have to transmit this knowledge, they would have to simplify and say, okay, we're going to teach this guy to punch the same way that he would be doing this particular sword stroke or whatever. Or we're going to teach this guy to block in the same way that he would block if he actually had a shield strapped to that forearm. And thankfully, there'll be some degree of carryover, even if it's imperfect. But oh well, we're not trying to train all these guys to be the best bare knuckle boxers in the world. We're trying to train them to be soldiers who can make do in the widest kind of possible collection of scenarios that we can. So just to circle back to my point there, that may have been passed down from generation to generation to generation in all these different lineages of teachers. But the context by the time it gets to moderns is wildly different. We don't have the same concerns as populations in those parts of histories where all of a sudden, coming down the rice field, here comes all the horse-bound warriors with spears and stuff. Oh no, now we better defend, or whatever it is, So when things get passed down from generation to generation to generation, the context does not always come with it. So people's diets at different parts of history become kind of a concern as far as a variable, because things about the ecosystem were different, things about the society were different. If we're talking about the diets that yogis were instructed to use back in, whenever, like medieval times or even before, there were a lot of different contexts there where a modern has other options. They don't have, like, for example, in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is like a yoga text, just to put it simply, they'll talk about how your mud hut should be organized and situated so that you can have good meditative practice. We're not hermits living in mud huts, most of us. And yet we're still learning from these lineages where we suddenly have to say, like, well, are we going to do everything the way this book says? Because does that mean that we got to go in mud huts? And the answer to that, of course, in my opinion, is no. But then that begs the question, what else in this pure lineage of an embodied practice are we going to carry with us? So this is a challenge that's implicit for an embodied practice. And if this is anything other than like a Western philosophical project where we're just arguing or talking or writing the entire time, meaning like, no, there's actually something that we do with our bodies, which is a crucial component of all this topic. The bodies in different points of history are going to be doing different things, and contexts are going to change. And that basically, to me, means that anyone doing these embodied practices who are still trying to have an authentic spiritual experience, they kind of have to be doing it from the time and place that they're at. And for me, a big part of that is not getting caught up in like arguments or atomic levels of specificity that don't apply to this time and place anymore, and definitely not getting caught up in like hierarchical, quote unquote, pure lineage things that somehow or another are going to tell me that I can't have a spiritual experience if I don't do something that was instructed for people in a completely different time and place. So all these things are subject to change. And you have to consider that even if there's a possibility that all the instruction you're getting was passed down perfectly from such a far time back in history and different times and places, that the things that they were perfectly passing down, for one thing, might not have even been correct, because there may not have been a way to test all of them. But for another thing, even if they were correct, they might have been for a very different time and place. So embodied practices for me means, just like a body grows and adapts throughout the course of its lifetime, an embodied practice should also grow and adapt according to the ever-growing body of humanity and its different times and its places. We don't do things the same way when we're a child, a teenager, an adult, and someone going into our twilight years, when the body starts to degrade. At each one of those times, we should be doing things a little bit differently. And you can use that metaphor, in my opinion, the same way for the historical growth of humanity. In humanity's childhood, we did things one way that was appropriate for the childhood of humanity. In its adulthood, same. And its twilight years, same. So this is just an offering. It's a topic that's very frequently on my mind when we talk about embodied practices as an essentially spiritual pursuit. But while there are also nonetheless parts of it that involve doing things with your body, where you can do things either correctly or incorrectly, but then also looking at what the standard is by which it's judged correctly or incorrectly. And on top of all that, having at least some grain of salt or skepticism about whether or not it means you're not having a full spiritual experience anymore if some part of what you're doing is judged to be quote unquote incorrect by someone from a quote unquote pure lineage, and someone who's very hung up on the atomic level of specificity of things passed down in an unbroken line of succession from some sacred script or some line of gurus initiated into whatever. So my goal there is not to degrade or exclude any of the actual magic that comes along with these sorts of things, of learning from teachers and having, my teacher's teacher's teacher pass this down. That's a wonderful and magical thing. But I guess my recommendation would be to have that in one of your hands as a reference point, and then in the other of your hands, having the freedom to look at yourself as a human being who's in an ever-changing coordinate of time and space, knowing that our conditions are never that our conditions are never eternal, but they are more historical. Some things about our conditions might be eternal, like we have consciousness, just like our ancestors did. We need to eat, sleep, breathe, just like our ancestors did. But so many other things about it are subject to change, that a certain amount of our own participation in these embodied practices, in my opinion, should also be subject to change. So I hope this sort of extended monologue was giving you something useful to think about and consider from your own perspective, and enjoy your practice, whatever that practice looks like for you.